Hello and welcome to my channel Malavika's Magic. Today I'll be sharing with you my views on barriers to communication. So let us understand the meaning first. Barriers means the obstacles or the hindrances that take place in the communication process. Now, these obstacles could be as a result of various factors, that is, the external factors or the internal factors, and that have actually results in disruption of information or disruption of the message conveyed by the sender. So let us understand the different types of barriers. So the first type is interpersonal barriers. The second is intrapersonal barriers or psychological barriers. And the third is organizational barriers. In this particular video, I'll be dealing with interpersonal barriers, and in my subsequent videos, I will discuss about interpersonal and organizational barriers. So let us start by understanding interpersonal barriers. Interpersonal barriers occur when the sender and the receiver, they are communicating either in formal or informal situation. And it is said that most of these barriers are outside an individual's own self. So let us first understand what can cause these type of barriers. So the sender could have a poor self-esteem about himself, and this could result in inappropriate choice of selection of words that could be very confusing to the receivers, and the information may not be imparted effectively. Then social anxiety, the social expectations could also create inhibitions in the mind of the sender, and this could result in inappropriate information that is conveyed to the receiver. Lack of cultural understanding from the sender's end could also result in poor communication. And then you have misperception. A perception is based on our experience or our observation, and by also reading books. And we might misinterpret, all our experiences or our observation and the information that we receive from books, and therefore this could result in misperception. And then the bias that is formed in a mind could be as a result of giving more importance to what other people say or what inputs the other people give, and this it could result in inappropriate communication with the receivers. So having understood the causes that would lead to the interpersonal barriers, let us understand the different types of barriers. So first is we have the language barrier, or it is also called as linguistic barrier. The second is emotional outburst. The third is incongruity of verbal and non-verbal messages. The fourth is cultural variations. The fifth is poor listening skills. The sixth is noise in the channel. And the seventh is communication selectivity. So now let us understand each one of them in detail and also try to find out how to minimize this type of barriers. So first is a linguistic barrier or language barrier. So these barriers could occur due to various reasons. The first reason could be due to the language communicated by the sender. The receivers may not understand the language communicated by the sender, or could understand a different language. And so therefore, the difference in the languages could result in barriers or miscommunication in the process. Now, in spite of using the same language, also there could be barriers in the process. This could be as a result of the sender using the dialectical variations of that language that the receivers may not be aware of, and thus this could lead to misinterpretation or miscommunication. The next type of barriers that could exist is semantic barriers, that is the difference of meanings assigned to particular word. Now, when the sender uses denotative words, as we all know, there is only one meaning assigned to these words. But when the sender uses connotative words where various meanings are assigned to this word, it could have, lead to difference of interpretation, or it could lead to misinterpretation, as the receivers may not be aware of the different meanings that is assigned to one particular word. And so there could be a miscommunication in the process. For example, the word cheap, it has various meanings depending upon a context. So it is necessary for us to understand the context before we interpret the meaning of a particular word. Then comes the jargon. The sender might assume, have a wrong assumptions made, and so this could result in the use of technical words that is specific to his or her background, and thus the receiver may not be able to understand the information transmitted by the sender, and thus this could lead to barriers in the process. For example, when the doctor communicates with the patient, might use particular terms that is appropriate to his medical background, but may not be understood by the receiver who does not belong to the medical background. So we have understood the different types of linguistic barriers, but how do we overcome these barriers? We cannot overcome these barriers completely, but we can at least minimize these barriers by understanding that the receiver's background, by understanding the receiver's age group, and also by understanding that the receiver's knowledge about the use of words and so on. So all this information should be gathered from the sender, and accordingly the sender should initiate the process of communication. So having understood linguistic barriers, let us now move on to the next barrier, that is communication selectivity. Now, communication selectivity occurs because the receiver is interested only to listen to a part of the information that is communicated, as it conforms to his or her values and beliefs. Apart from that, anything that does not conform to his or her values or beliefs, that receiver is not interested. Let us take this example that as a person, I believe in arranged marriages. So any information related to arranged marriages, I will keenly pay attention to it. But information that is related to other aspects, for example, a discussion on a live-in relationship, I will not give importance to it, and thus that could result in barriers, because I'm listening to only part of the information and not listening to the information in entirety, and so therefore will not be able to give a proper feedback to the sender. Now, this barrier could also be overcome if the sender, the receiver, take proper care, to understand that there could be various perspectives, about a particular aspect, and we should be open and not rigid, to this perspectives. So let us now move on to the next barrier, that is emotional outburst. And emotional outburst is a very common type of barrier that exists in our day-to-day interaction with people, because we never know when a person gets angry and starts using words inappropriately, and thus there could be misinterpretation of information. So when we are angry, we are not in a logical self, we speak illogically, and most of the time our choice of words is also not appropriate, so that this could lead to confusion or miscommunication in the process. So in order to minimize this barrier, we should maintain our composure, and we should also view issues from different perspectives, so that we are flexible in understanding a particular concept. Then let us move on to the next type of barrier, that is incongruity of verbal and non-verbal messages. That means there is a mismatch between the verbal messages and the non-verbal signals. In oral communication, that is in face-to-face communication, the non-verbal signals are bound to be used by the sender, and the sender, most of the time, has to take a proper, care of how to use these non-verbal signals, because the non-verbal signals that he or she uses should be, matched with the verbal messages that he passes. If he does not take this care, then obviously there could be a mismatch between the non-verbal cues and the verbal messages, and this could result in confusion in the minds of the receivers, and thus disrupt the communication process. So non-verbal signals need not be ignored, but they should be interpreted on the basis of the cultural understanding, and also on the basis of the understanding of the context in which it is used. So having said this, I would like to move on to the next aspect, that is cultural variations. when the sender has an inadequate knowledge of the culture that the receiver belongs to, the region that receivers belongs to, that could become a barrier in the process. For example, like in our culture, in the Indian culture, we greet people by folding our hands and saying namaste. But this is not applicable universally. So when we go to other countries, we have to understand the cultural differences, and we also need to make a note of how we should be, how people are greeted in that particular region. So once we understand that, then we can easily adapt ourselves to that particular situation, and we can also have a better understanding of our receivers and also be understood by the receivers. Having said this, I will now move on to the next aspect, that is poor listening skills is another barrier. We have found that when we are communicating with people, most of the time, the listeners, they do not listen with utmost care. This is because the listeners, they get distracted in the process. This distraction could be because of external noise, or it could be in the form of, other noise that occurs in the mind of the receivers. For example, if he is suffering from poor health, that could become a barrier, because he might be thinking of going to the doctor. Or if if he has to submit an assignment, for example, he's preoccupied with that thought, how he would complete the assignment and so on. So that could result in poor listening skills, lack of concentration and poor listening skills. Now, I would say that if the receiver has to minimize this barrier, he or she should be empathetic towards the sender and give due attention or concentrate on the message conveyed by the sender, and thus minimize this type of barrier. Now, let us move on to the next type of barrier, that is noise in the channel, which is also called as physical or external barrier. It is also called as environmental barrier. Now, this environmental barrier exists because of the time. And now the sender does not have an appropriate information about the convenient time of the receivers, will tend to communicate at odd hours, and this could actually spoil the relation between the sender and the receiver. And instead of building relationship or building rapport with the receiver, you could actually spoil the relationship, and it could be very harmful from the business perspective also. So time is a very important factor when you're communicating. And then comes a space. The space between the sender and the receiver could be used either to exercise your power or a control, or you can use in order to build rapport or understanding or build relationships. If the space is used in an appropriate manner, then communication between the sender and the receiver takes place effectively. Otherwise, there could be misinterpretation of information. Then comes the place. The place refers to the setting, that is whether it is a formal or an informal setting. So if the communication takes place in a formal setting, so appropriate words have to be used, and of course non-verbal signals also have to be used accordingly. So proper care has to be taken by the sender or the receiver in understanding the setting or the place where it is communicated. And so having understood noise in the channel, we can now move on to the mechanical barriers. The mechanical barriers exist because of the devices or the instruments that we use, while we want to communicate to the receivers. For example, if the sender is communicating to a large audience, then of course he will have to use a microphone or take the help of the microphone to reach out, to be audible to all the people in the audience. So now when we are relying on an instrument, there could be problems in the instrument that could result in barriers, as all the receivers may not be able to hear what they are saying. And moreover, let us take the example of these online classes. We are so used to these online classes that we use the devices in order to impart information to the online classes. These devices could be in the form of the computer or the laptop, and we also are dependent on the cables, the wire, the internet cables, and in order to transmit information. Now, sometimes the cables could be faulty, or there could be problems in the internet connectivity. The network problems could arise, and thus the message could get distorted in the process. So this mechanical barriers could be overcome if we check the instrument prior to the communication, prior to initiating the process of communication. All the instruments have to be checked, the devices have to be checked, the internet connectivity have to be checked, so that the information is passed without any problems or difficulties. And so now I would like to say thank you to all of you for your patient listening. I would also like to say that in my subsequent videos, I will be talking about interpersonal and organizational barriers. Till then, thank you.